and stuff. All right, so this is Friday.
Day 10 of our captivity. We have demands.
Synod ended Thursday, and we have spent the night. We went out. You went out with friends. Had a nice time. Yeah. Had a chance to sleep in a little bit, hopefully, get a little extra sleep. And I kind of wanted to talk about CRC past, present, and future. I clipped Lava Soap. I really liked Lava Soap. We really have to have Rod. You really have to record more of your poems. I don't know if you've got a decent mic or if you know how to record stuff, but you've got some great stuff. And you know who Martin Shaw is?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who Martin Shaw is? I'll have to introduce. I'll have to get Martin Shaw out.
Yeah.
And he's good friends with Malcolm Guyte.
Yeah, he's the wild twin one, right?
Yeah.
I just read that. That was.
Yeah. So we'll have to get Martin and Malcolm out to Sacramento. How would you like that?
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
We'll have to get Martin out, and
Malcolm's great.
You would love these guys.
They would. Well, I can't speak. I think Malcolm would love you.
Yeah. Martin would too. Martin's just a wonderful guy. Anyway, CRC past, present, and future. Aleah has, well, we talked. If you're curious about Aleah, we went through her story on a previous video. You can look that up. But she came into the CRC. When you're young, so about what year did you come into Fairfield CRC?
Mike and I got married in 2004, so probably 2003.
Wow. So I was born in '63. What year were you born?
52.
52. All right, so.
Safe journeys, everyone.
All right. My mother was born in '38. You know, lots of stories from her. What I really loved about Lava Soap, and I'll post that as a separate video. It really got a sense of the CRC that went away quickly with. Well, let's talk about that transition, because you and I lived through that transition. The CRC was, and that, things don't just stop in one place. They kind of go through the church, and you can still find places where you can sort of feel the old CRC. Rod, how would you describe that CRC, the good and the bad?
Yeah, growing up, well, I was born in Pella, Iowa, so that's a center of the CRC and the Dutch colony and so I spent the first 8 years of my life there, and I think that was keep the Sabbath, right? It was don't get caught doing bad things, and you might have done them, but you never got caught. Then it was the community itself, it was all Dutch people, it was all, I didn't see a person of color until I moved to Phoenix. At 8, it was like there just weren't any, and so you didn't have any kind of diversity at all. And in a little town of 10,000 people, there were, 6 Christian Reformed churches or whatever, and a couple RCA churches. So it was. You knew part of that small town, right? You knew everybody and everybody knew you. But then when we moved to Phoenix, it was the same thing. Because you all moved close together, and we had the Phoenix Christian Reformed Church down the road. A few blocks was Phoenix Christian Grade School, which is where I went. And we kept everybody out, not because we intended to, but because we came together. I always admired the fact that when we moved down there for health reasons, my father had emphysema. They said if you don't go to a warmer, drier climate, you'll be dead soon. And he did die 8 years later, but after we moved. But there was everybody in that church came there because of health reasons, and so they cared for each other incredibly. The stories I could tell about how they just, you know, when my dad died, bags of groceries appeared on our doorstep. They brought in all this furniture, new furniture for us, and and they took care of us. My tuition got paid at the Christian grade school, not because my mother had any money, she didn't, but because kind-hearted people took care of. We didn't extend that grace to the people around us as much, but within the colony, within that group, and yeah, the preaching was boring. I studied my catechism and memorized it, not because I was cared, but because I had to. It was how you spent your Sundays, because you weren't allowed to ride your bike, so you had to do something. The banner discussion at Synod was interesting because I did look forward to the banner, and who's the Blue Marble guy that wrote Eppinga? Jacob Eppinga always wrote the little thing at the back, and I loved those things.
Cabbages and Kings was a
Cabbages and
huge
Kings,
thing.
right? And got his books later on. So it's just, I admit, I have nostalgia for those days, you know, the organ in the church, the pianist, the big choir, the blending of the voices. In Phoenix, you get these big dust storms that would blow in, and you could, you know, we'd always have the windows open, and then all of a sudden the windows are slamming shut because the wind is going through, and it felt Holy Spirit-ish or something. It was just awesome. And Reformation Day rallies and services, and it was a beautiful thing, and it was a great way to grow up. And I was trained in that, right? I was elders who cared about me, and yeah.
It was a serious community. So my growing up was different in that my father was, you know, it was a mission church, and this is when I talk about bringing back evangelists and chapels. There's this little chapel. African Americans came up from the South, and they were poor, and Dutch immigrants who had lived sort of in the grimy places in Patterson were moving out to better houses after the war and leaving their buildings and leaving their neighborhoods, and African Americans were coming in, and you know, some of the Dutch were like fleeing, but often widows, older women. They looked at these people suffering, and they're like, and it's often the case. I really like what you say, Rod, about Phoenix, in that, in a sense, they were a community of refugees. They were health refugees. Right. And so they knew what it meant to suffer. And it's often the case that people who know what it means to suffer are the ones that are best able to care for others who suffer. And so it was often widows who, these are the grandmas, and they would come and they would do these things in these chapels. And the duchies were moving out and moving their institutions out and all of that, but these widows would stay behind and take care of these folks in the ways that they knew how. And then they called my father to Patterson, and he was supposed to, you know, they had been paying for this chapel for a while between the CRC churches, and they said, you know, we should turn this into a real church. So they called a seminarian who had done some field assignment there, and he came, and it was, you know, his other call was to northern Alberta. I would have been Jordan Peterson maybe, who knows. But the woman he married, she was from Whitensville, and that was only 4 hours north of Patterson. So they go to Patterson, and they start to take this little mission and turn it into a church. And it was all old school CRC stuff. You had the CRC liturgy every Sunday. You sang only from the Psalter hymnal,
Correct.
and
Which Psalter hymn was it?
the blue Psalter
Yeah,
hymnal.
right.
It was the blue. We
Not the
were
red, you were advanced.
right, but I did go.
Progressives.
I did go to Christian school. There was Eastern Christian there, and so weekdays, once I started going to school, were spent with other Dutch kids, but weekends were Patterson, inner city, black folks. And that already was sort of a hybrid of the Christian Reformed Church that, say, you knew. And I would visit that Christian Reformed Church when I would go up to Whitensville. We'd go up there for holidays. That's where my mother was from. And my cousins were all there, and they all went to the same church. And there were two Christian Reformed churches. There was our church and the other church. And of course, if somebody had a snit about something, they're going to the other church. And so people would go back and forth between the churches. And then there was a conference ground. It's so interesting how these certain American things would sort of wash over the CRC, and CRC people would sort of take them and appropriate them. And so in the 50s, conference grounds, or in the 30s, 20s too, were a big thing. But the CRC wasn't a revivalist thing, church. So, and then of course, camping came in the 70s, and so they carved out a few little campsites, and we'd go camping there in the summer, and there was a pond, and all my cousins would come, and the CRC churches were just filled with kids, and so that became sort of the backyard for all of the CRC people there. There's a version of that in New Jersey called Terrace Lake, and the New Jersey colony was way larger. Every now and then, Terrace Lake cost money to go there, and my parents didn't have much money. It was a little ways away, but every now and then someone would give our family a membership to that. And so then we'd go up there, and it was a real, it was a little colony within, especially New Jersey, within a much larger, it was a ghetto basically. And that's, that's the way life was. And then, of course, part of the, I was in preparing for my speech, or my speeches, and I didn't actually prepare a speech, I was just thinking about it in anticipation of the banner conversation and doing a little playing with AI, because one of the members of my committee said, AI is scraping this stuff, and AI is compositing a picture of the CRC from the scrapes in the banner, and AI not known for accuracy. But it was interesting how often the banana came up in the AI posts, because that period when that counterculture sort of moved through America, boy, the CRC changed fast in the 70s and 80s, and the CRC had these educational institutions and networks in order to sort of surface the elites of the extended community, and those elites would then be the leaders of the institutions. And this was how this, this community of 100, 200, 300,000 people lived. And so, and the Dutch came to America. I wish Nate Van Dennen was here, was talking about it. They built institutions. And you start your Christian school, you start your Holland home, you start your other institutions, and those institutions become the glue that sort of keeps it together. And then Fairfield was supposed to be one of the first non-nucleus CRC church plants. And Kevin Adams did his internship there. And who's the Hoffman? Gary Hoffman. Hoffman. First missionary there. But of course, by the time you get there, and it's sort of, part of what happened with these CRC mission churches is they very much sort of had to take on, so you started in an evangelical and then wound up there. Maybe talk a little bit about what was sort of distinct about the CRC to the degree that you could tell it in your young life.
That's interesting, because it's wild to look back through my 17-year-old lens, because that's when I kind of came into the picture. And for me, it was just Mike and I were getting more serious. He was at a CRC church, but neither of us were from kind of, Christian background. We hadn't been in church attending homes, and so he ended up there kind of through the youth ministry. And we had met through a mutual friend outside of church altogether, but I was at this evangelical church, so my main pull was that Mike and I wanted to start attending church together. So that's kind of where I ended up in the evangelicals when I went to leave the church I had been at basically since I could drive and get myself there. They were like, "You're going to join the Calvinists? They don't even believe in missions." And I was like, "Really? Weird. They seem all right. I don't really know. My boyfriend's there." That was the extent of my thinking through entering the CRC. And yeah, I just, you assume when you don't have the larger picture that you're getting the full picture, right? So coming into Fairfield, I'm like, well, the CRC is, I'm not really sure what Reformed is, and I don't really know that I could communicate what Reformed is exactly, but these people seem great. But there was, at the time that I came in, this kind of Reformed Baptist fundamentalist kind of faction within the church that kind of took interest in Mike and I, like young couple, we're not there with family, had a lot of opinions on the decisions we should be making at that point in our life, and were not shy about letting us know. And we were just kind of like, okay, I guess this is what this is. So actually my introduction to the CRC was more like John MacArthur, and I assumed that's what the whole was like, because I didn't recognize that was actually its own faction within the larger church body. So yeah, I came into that, and so it was, I kid you not, like many, many years before I even knew that there was a Dutch connection with the CRC. Because it wasn't like I was in a congregation full of Dutch people.
Right.
I hadn't been introduced at any point really to Dutch culture, and so I didn't even recognize that some of these names maybe had, connotations or sounded the same. And yeah, it was years and years before I found that out. But it was a wonderful church that brought people in. Like, it was attractional in the sense that, not attractional in the sense like when you get there, you're like, oh, this is a slick production, and or doing create a bunch of evangelism that's bringing people in. But if you attended, if you met the minimum requirement of just showing up on Sundays, there was no way not to get woven into that community.
Yeah.
They just brought you in, and it was, the pros and cons of that. It depends on the ones who are showing the most interest in bringing you in. And so Mike and I ended up that was part of our journey within that space. But having, it was my first introduction to infant baptism, which I didn't totally understand, but I felt like when we met with the pastor that he made a pretty good case for it. I was just like, that actually feels more for me, intellectually satisfying and actually that's what I think made me, just in the way God has made me to be, to find that I found a lot of intellectual satisfaction in the preaching and the teaching, and the more I started to understand Reformed theology, the more I was like, this is actually answering questions I kind of had in my evangelical experience that I felt weren't satisfactory answers for. So yeah, it was a lovely community, is a lovely community that was very welcoming, and we had our own journeys within that space. And then it was not until, really, probably the beginning of Sierra leadership, when I started doing that with you, when I was starting to get a kind of a fuller picture, probably around when I was starting to write more widely, and writing some evangelical publications, that I started to kind of understand where I fit into the conversation, because people would be like, oh, you're CRC, that means this, and I'd be like, oh, really? Interesting. And then, my first trip out to Grand Rapids, when I was in seminary, and that wasn't it. My first trip out to Grand Rapids, I was going out for a festival of faith and writing, and staying with my pastor's wife's parents, who I now call my Michigan parents, because they're who I stay with when I go to Grand Rapids. And I just was floored by, I'm like, oh, there's a Christian Reformed church. Drive, 200 yards, there's a Christian Reformed church. And I'm like, what is this place? I had just assumed so much on my experience. There's a Christian, no one knows what the Christian Reformed church is where I live. No one had any frame of reference for that. And there's never more than one within 20 miles of each other. And so to be in a place that was that concentrated, I was like, oh, this is something different. And then being on what was then Calvin College's campus and seeing where the seminary was, and I was like, oh, it just completely changed my framework.
Yeah. So, Rod, of course, your story. Rod, I didn't know how to describe Rod's story. You and institutions in the Christian Reformed Church, you went to Christian school growing up. You didn't go to Calvin College. You went to a state school.
No, Grand Canyon College, or Southern Baptist College.
Southern Baptist College.
At the time.
Was
Not the Grand Canyon College of today or University of today. But.
How did that impact you? I've never explored this with you. How did that impact you growing up CRC and then going to an institution in the bigger evangelical pond?
So my dad died when I was 16, right? So on his deathbed, he said, Rod, you need to take care of your mother, your sisters, and your brother. I'm dying, I will not be here. Which was an awful curse to put on a 16-year-old kid, which I didn't discover until I was in my 50s, what an awful curse that was, but through a good counselor. So I felt responsible to take care of Mom, right? And so I worked, and I got a job right after Dad died. As a matter of fact, I got hired and started like a week after the funeral. And I worked as a stock boy in an auto parts company, right? And school was hard for me. I was not a good student. My older sister was valedictorian of every class she's ever been in. She went to Dordt College, and we had lots of relatives in Iowa, so that was the natural thing for her. And then I kind of wanted to go, but I had to take care of Mom. So then my brother went to Dordt as well and graduated from there. Miriam was already at Dordt, my older sister. And then, so now what am I going to do? Well, you got to get educated, right? That was a high value. I'm a poor student, and I'm working. At that time, I worked as a janitor, I worked at the auto parts place, I mowed lawns. You know, you do what you can to take care of Mom. And so I went to Grand Canyon, and I would say I made the dean's list, which after the first year, I made the dean's list that says if you don't bring your grades up.
Oh, you made that dean's list.
You're out of here. We don't need your kind here. Which is not the great dean's list. Just for the record. And then I was tired and I was working hard, and so I would do the minimum that a class required, right? So I would go to the professor and say, what do I have to do, right? And this one professor didn't, he had nothing that said that you had to be there. This is for a Bible class, right? For a New Testament class. And there's nothing that says I have to be at class. Well, I know this stuff. So I just showed up for the exams, aced every exam because how hard is it? Then discovered too late that attendance did matter. So I failed the class, right? And
failed Bible.
Yes. So that was really bad. It's humiliating. So there was this lovely professor so I had to retake the class, right? So this professor, he later became president of the college. So he was just a sweet, sweet man. He said, he came to me first day of class. He had met me and we had talked before. And he said, Mr. Hugen, I know that you are a Calvinist, and this is a Southern Baptist College, and I have all these wannabe super pastors, wannabe, you know, in my classes, and no one challenges them. So he says, you got an A, I'll give you an A, but I want you to show up for every class, and I want you to make them think. I want you to challenge I want you to bring your doctrines and the things you believe, your training, which was just a beautiful thing, right? Like it was really fun to know you were secure in the grades, which is all I really needed. And then still had that freedom to just be yourself. And that really shaped me a lot, I think. It took me 8 years to get my degree. And what happened was, in that second year, I met the lovely Mrs. Hugen. Fetching Kathy Miller was just, we met in archery class. Doesn't get better than that, right? And we also had speech class together, so I started walking her around the campus, and she was studying to be a nurse. So she could only go there for 2 years and then had to transfer out to ASU to get Arizona State to get her degree in nursing. So I was courting her, and then I dropped out because I just didn't have it. My grades were horrible. I was a second semester freshman and a third semester freshman, whatever. Anyway, I was well down from where I should have been. So I dropped out. I went to work for an auto parts company, the same auto parts company. And then I got a job at another auto parts place, and then the original company, Charlie C. Jones, Battery Electric Company. Mr. Mencher was the muckety-muck CEO of that company, and he said, Rod, go back, you're way too smart to be peddling parts like you are. Go get your degree in business and come back and run this place for me. So I went back to school. Well, now I'm older, smarter, not smarter, but I knew all I want is a piece of paper. I don't care how I get it. I don't have to. And so I got my degree in business administration. But at that time, I'm married, I've got kids, I've got, so it's harder. And, but yeah, Kathy was working as a nurse. We were doing okay. And I could still help mom, right? So it worked out. But that training, that opened my eyes, to a whole different world of theology, a way of thinking. I was way outside my bubble. The high school I had gone to was also what are the people where I forget the tribe you can lose your salvation every other day. So they had altar calls constantly. Anyway, whichever, wasn't a Baptist thing, but anyway. So I was being stretched a lot. One of the young guys that I mentor, he was on a trip somewhere, and he said, I ran into this Christian Reform muckety-muck in the CRC, and he said to me that he respected you because you were innovative and trying new things and all that, but you were rooted, and you, instead of disparaging your roots, you loved your roots, you honor them, and that kind of stuck with me, because I think that's true. I really honor my roots. I really love how I was steeped in the faith by godly parents, but then how do you bring that to California where there's no Dutch people?
Well, I think that's so interesting that you say that, because for me, when I came into my early seminary education, I felt like everyone was kind of embarrassed about being CRC.
Right.
And I was like, this is so cool. Like, I didn't realize this is even what I was a part of. And one of your first classes is CRC history. And I was like, this is fascinating what these people have accomplished, and I'm a part of this. And it was at Calvin where I started, even through the distance program, I was growing a sense of institutional identity there, and it was like, I'm proud to be a part of this. But then anyone I talked to who was kind of a certain age, which was super helpful for me about some of the conversations we've had even here, seemed very embarrassed about some of what I felt like were the distinctives of the CRC as I was coming to understand.
Right.
And so it was very confusing for me. Because I was like, oh wait, we're embarrassed about this? Why are we embarrassed about this part? I think it's kind of cool. Then I was like, kind of gaslighting myself, like, okay, what about me is making me? But I think it was seeing, this seems like a really beautiful and rich history. I don't have that in my childhood, right? I don't have a thick network of cultural relationship, and I'm like, can I be a part of this one? I think it's really cool. So it's interesting to hear you say that because that was like my exact opposite of what I felt like I was getting in the seminary. And so that was my thing coming even out of seminary. I was like, why don't we lean more into how we're distinct instead of trying to make everyone feel like, well, we're actually, all of this is fine. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but when I study it for myself, I like that part of it. I don't know.
I think that's a big piece of this banana counterculture moment. I heard recently someone sort of course, Rusty Reno's written this book in 2019, Return of the Strong Gods, talks about the post-war consensus, talks about how in the 50s you have this sense of, it's multi-layered, of course, because if you think about what happens in the 40s, you've got, especially what we know in terms of trauma, you've got massive numbers of people that have been traumatized at various levels. You've got trauma from the Depression. You've got trauma from all different angles of the wars. And then you get this 1950s where American industry pivots from war production now to consumer goods, and culturally Americans are turned into consumers. I mean, even today when they study Americans, we have been trained to consume. We consume like nobody else in the world. And then you have this, you have on one hand the anxiety of the Cold War, where the bomb, the world could end because of the nukes. But you also have this sense of security, people, it's just this mashup of things. And then when the counterculture starts to hit, you have this question of, part of what happens then in the war is that the hypocrisy of the old guard gets exposed. How could the church allow this to be done to the Jews in Europe? How could the church have allowed this to be done to African Americans 100 years after the Civil War? How in the church could we have been so horrible in North America because remember, the Klan not only wanted to kill blacks, they wanted to kill Jews and Catholics too. And so in the middle of the 20th century, you have the civil rights movement gaining steam, but you also have this integration of Catholics and Jews into the WASPy elites. And of course, the Dutch we're white Anglos, we're not really Anglo-Saxon, but we can sort of, we're white Protestants. We have our own institutions. We're sort of looking at the WASPs, and we're not Episcopal. The rank order is Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist. There's the rank order. And so we're in this, but then it was in one of those podcasts where someone recognizes that what the counterculture does is turn on their parents and say, you were hypocrites. You said you loved people, but look at how you treated the Jews in Europe. Look at how you treated the Catholics in America. look at how you treated the African Americans. Or, this is mostly an East Coast thing. So, indigenous peoples, Mexicans.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the counterculture turns, and what you have in the West in this post-war consensus is a huge crisis of confidence. And I think that's very much what you picked up. Because then in the era of the banana, the elites are the ones who champion this new openness. We are going to be, sure, we're Christian. The conversation hadn't really turned. And actually the timing is very interesting because 1970s, the banana hits, but those are college students, okay? 1980, you have burning the wooden shoes. So, you still takes a decade to get in there. But it was all of this self-reflection. We've got to take apart our institutions. We've got to take down our walls. And we have to, it's time to burn the wooden shoes. But what we didn't, I think, realize was, and no more Erich Sehot, which is this glory to God song that actually came, the Dutch after the war brought it over. I researched that at one point because I wondered, when did they start singing it? It was like written in the 20s or the 30s. So that wasn't a part of the 19th century Dutch immigrants. It was a part of the afterwar. But at my church in Sacramento, they had a fierce fight over, because the church, Sacramento CRC, was one of these racial reconciliation church. But unlike Northside, where there's just a few Dutchies, and they're there for the program, they really want to be there, Sac CRC was a outpost church, so you had some diaspora Dutch, but then you had African Americans, and also you've also got Asians, Pacific Islanders, Hispanics, because of course Sacramento is it's not just black and white out east. And so we can't sing these Dutch songs. Okay. And so that crisis of confidence, that dribbles up, and we've had that. And so, in our subcommittee, when they're editing this document and they strike out, we just deleted it. But then, of course, when you have the strikeout, you have it on the big screen, you have the strikeout through diversity, and it's like, buzzwords are holy words. I mean, you might as well be saying something not appropriate about Jesus when you strike out diversity. I mean, that's part of it. But, I think, Rod, one thing that you brought and you bring is, you didn't necessarily, because neither of you were sort of in the elite areas of the denomination, you didn't go through that period. And so, part of what we see happening is now, and this is how I know a lot of, I called myself a boomer, and technically I am, but a lot of people look at me and say, not really boomer. A lot of the people, say 10 years older than myself, who have been in the elite institutions, where they are just in crisis now, is because the new conservatives and moderates, I would say, in many ways they've already sort of subsumed and ingested the diversity, but they go back and they say, hey, we have black heritage, we have Hispanic heritage, we have all these heritages. We have a heritage. Why can't we celebrate our heritage? And interestingly enough, in a place like Living Stones in Sacramento, there's many African Americans that will be very open to say, we came for your heritage. That's what drew us here. And, it wasn't the African Americans that said, stop singing Dutch songs. They were a little fascinated by the Dutchy stuff, and they kind of liked it. It was usually the CRC elites that had gone through this much bigger wave of saying, we've got to stop our own particularity so we can enfold the Jews and the Catholics and the African Americans and that overemphasis then But now we're sort of having this recalibration again where, no, we should be proud, and maybe we should be a little bit more bold.
Well, and I mean, I have to name too, though, that the fruit of some of that was for women.
Yes.
Like, I would not be in the position I'm in the CRC
Right.
if that generation had not come through and disrupted the institution of it, right? So I can't just be like, what I really like, we can't just have, I want like the repristination of the early CRC is what I really want, because I wouldn't get to exist as I do in the CRC in that space. So I don't, there's that tension there though of, and I think when you were talking about the our heritage, my husband at his first classes meeting who had fresh stroopwafels for the first time, and it was a life event that he could talk about, but I think it's interesting the way what heritage means different things to different people in the CRC, I have found, because there are some people who are like, we are here for your pure doctrine, right? We're starting to get some of that, and we are going to, that's our unifying point of heritage is going to be the doctrine. And then you miss out on all of the practice and all of these pieces that held together the doctrine in a way that it got lived out beautifully. And so that's, what do we mean by the heritage that we're looking back to, I think is really important.
Yeah.
That's so. Living in the '60s, I didn't have time to protest. Literally, I mean, when would I have done that? My wife says that often. Don't these people have a good job? Like, don't they have to go to work tomorrow? Like,
Protester privilege.
Right. It sort of is. Like, and so the institutional stuff that was happening back in Grand Rapids, where all this was taking place, it was lost on people like me, not just because we were in the hinterlands, but because we were too busy surviving, right? And we did things that, I call it great white fathering, right? Like, so when I became an evangelist, I think I was like the fourth white person to become an evangelist. They made that so that classes Red Mesa, all the native, all the Apache, or the Navajo and Hopi, so that they could ordain and preach and teach and do on the reservation, because no white guy's going to go out there. And almost to this day, the pride of a church on the reservation is, we got a Dutch white guy to come and be our pastor. That's horrible. And so I'm going to them and saying, you guys raise up indigenous leaders, you raise up leaders out of your, and that are leading your churches. This is the most amazing thing ever. Teach me how to do that, right? And they're looking at me like I'm odd, because I am, because there's that, and I sense this a lot when I'm in Grand Rapids, that sort of, we take care of our black people as if they needed taking care of, right? And Chris Samuels and I were just talking about that, young black man.
Made a big splash at Synod.
Right. And he said, he says, I don't get the overt racism stuff. It just doesn't happen hardly ever, right? Like, he says, in my life, I haven't really experienced that. Certainly parents did, but not. But he said that sort of looking down on you and saying, we'll help you as if you needed help, right? And that's more devastating. That's a worst kind of racism, and because you can't get out from underneath that. If there's a sign in the window that says no blacks allowed, okay, you know your place, and then I get to decide whether or not I'm not going to go in a place like that. But when you don't have the sign in the window, but the guy hates you anyway, and he's spitting in your food, cops experience this all the time when they go eat in restaurants, right? It's like, you don't know what the guy back there is thinking, or the owner's thinking, because we've pushed it down and made it unpopular. In some ways, that's hurt a lot of people, and So, and the same with women. Okay, we'll help women. Really? Like women can't preach? I've heard some great women preachers do, but oh no, we'll.
And even with the,
And you have to do it in some way. I just don't know how to do that to invite people into mission and ministry like you without creating the path, right? Like, I don't have to help you with the skill set, but you're right. You had to knock down the walls that would allow that to happen. So that,
and there can, and that, yeah, the help piece can feel hard, where it
Right.
is like, wait, am I being elevated in this situation beyond my own merits, or am I being elevated in this situation because I'm female and you need another one of me in the room?
that's exactly right.
And that isn't a great feeling. And it,
Well, that's why you're in this video.
I knew it.
Right.
And
I don't know what category you fit into, but
We were looking for a guy who.
But you know, and you can feel that can be kind of that chip on your shoulder. For me, the chip on my shoulder, I think I carried into seminary more than the female part of it, because I didn't go into seminary thinking I'd be a pastor on the other end. But for me, it was that I wasn't educated, and
Right.
so that was, I had to prove myself in every class that I belonged in that class by being the top of the class. But I think that what you were saying made me think too of, even among other women, it was an interesting experience, because there has been a little bit of a subtext of like, oh, well, the reason why I'm able to get along in the spaces that I'm in is because I have been so, you know, repressed by my conservative upbringing. And so I'm more able, you know, I don't know what real freedom is.
Right.
And so I'm happy with the kind of limitations that are in place.
oh, this is interesting.
And so there's kind of this like, well, you know, she just doesn't understand how bad it actually is, because she's not had real
Right.
freedom the way we have. Which I actually found, that was probably for me the most offensive thing that has happened to me. And the most like patronizing, where I was like, wait, that I can flourish in this system is only because I don't really know. I don't really understand what it's like. And that made me feel like more of an outsider than almost anything that had happened in any other context.
Wow,
That's amazing.
that's quite something. It's the levels of nuance and capacity, and I mean, you just never sort of get to the bottom of anything in this world, do you? I mean, that's something I'd never considered.
And I think Rod's right though, where it's like, but if you are going to bring in new voices and new spaces, you have to pave some paths. Like,
Yeah, right.
you have to elevate some people, or
Yeah.
there's not an imagination for the next generation coming through to help them develop that, oh, you know, I could do this. Like, you know, one of my favorite things at my church is I have this little group of young girls that I taught in Kinder First, because I rotate through the Kinder First class, which is like one of my favorite things to teach in the whole world, because you can just tell the story with excitement and they are just there for it. And that's how I want to preach. Like I just retell the story. But I have these little girls who are seeing me as their pastor from the time they are 4, you know, or younger, but especially this one little group that just, you know, they're asking, and I wear a collar, put it out there, but can I touch it? Like, I'm like, yeah, you know, I'm getting down and they're touching my collar and they're asking me questions, and they love coming in my office and seeing my books. And, you know, I have one little girl she's actually in 5th grade, and she's like asking me about some of my theology books on my study shelf, you know, and for me, that's like, I'm helping to form your imagination for what is possible in ways that it wasn't formed for me.
Okay.
But you have to open the door and get people through at some point. But when do you stop putting people through? Like, I think it was Mary Holst actually, who was talking about like, we'll really know when we've turned the corner on women in ministry when women feel like they can be average students at the seminary.
Or poor ones. Yeah,
Or poor-
right.
yeah.
Like I agree. And I think for me, not going to seminary and not like, I get a lot of that same thing, right? There's an intellectual snobbery. There's so when the first question I often get asked when I meet, so when did you graduate from seminary? You know,
Right.
well, I didn't. Well, how do you do what you do? Yeah, that's a problem. And it goes back to, when I was ordained as an evangelist, you are equal in honor, differing only in task. No, I'm equal in task, differing only in honor. Right? and it's true, and it's sad, because if you look at the fruit of your labor, then okay, what is it that a minister of the word has done that I haven't done, right? Within this church community that's developed, God's grown around me. It's a beautiful thing. So how does that work? And then, and it boils down to, well, you don't preach as well, probably, because you're not steeped in theology and you haven't. And I'll grant that. Like, I get that, but people I've gathered don't need.
No, you should not grant that. That's stupid.
I mean, it could be true. Like, I'm just saying, it's not beyond the realm, right?
Theologians are often not known for their preaching.
Right.
I'm just saying. Sorry, theologians out there. It's true.
So the honoring thing becomes like, do I honor you because you're a really good pastor and God's called you to do that, or do I honor you because you're a woman who's a good pastor who, that sucks. And I felt to that, so I think I've become more sensitive to that. And I get, if you didn't go the route that I went, you may not have that. I mean, we are intellectual snobs in our denomination. We worship formal education to our detriment. We don't. The book I wrote has the whole discipleship by walking with, yes, we explain the Torah. Jesus does that with his disciples, and then, hey, look, have you considered the lilies of the field? Oh, have you done? That it's the walking with, which I can do. And can I explain the Torah as well as someone else? Maybe not, but it doesn't matter, right? Like, I can explain it good enough, and and we worship formal education too, not just education, because as an avid reader and writer, I read all the time, and except now that I'm old and I can't see as good, so it's hard, but it's there's just a lot of ways to be educated, and then if you worship and raise education to this big thing, then you've missed on a lot of the beauty of what God does with his people in leadership.
Now we're in a moment when the HSR wars have exiled a lot of the boomer elites. The pattern of church affiliation, it's not only hitting East Grand Rapids, which was sort of the institutional center, it's hitting some other centers. Institute for Christian Studies, gone. Just at this Synod, we had the South Bend CRC. I forget, it's Church of the Savior, I think it is. Mm-hmm. They left. Now, someone might say, well, is that random? No. South Bend CRC is there so that Notre Dame can have Christian Reformed scholars go to.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what that church is about.
Huh.
So if you look at what has been exiled from the CRC, they are the boomer elites. That is, and then you've got a strata of them sprinkled throughout. And so now suddenly the Christian Reformed Church finds itself in a really interesting position where we've exiled all of our boomer elites who have been that they have, to a certain degree, held the culture, held the prestige, held all of that, right at the top. Now they were aging, Marsden, Waltersdorf, Plantinga, Mao, they're all still alive, but they're really getting up there. And then there were sort of those who were sort of in their draft, and part of what happened at this synod was very much a pivot, I think. We saw at Calvin Seminary, we talked about, I don't know if we talked about this on the one that was lost. So now you have, it used to be, so in the mid 20th century, Louis Berkhoff was the professor of systematics, was sort of the pristine chair of Calvin Seminary, because systematics was sort of at the top of the peak. And of course, Louis Berkhoff wrote all of that systematic theology. He was followed by Anthony Hoekema, who wrote something a little bit more popular, the books that he wrote, good books, really excellent books. Neil Plantinga, of course, professor of systematic theology. Mary Vandenberg came through, very popular teacher. I don't know that she's published much.
Not a lot, no.
But she was a very popular teacher. And now we have two new professors of systematics, and seeming to very much fit the times. I mean, I spend a lot of time with young men, and I'm listening to that guy talk, and we're watching all of these young, ministers of a certain age, racing to the microphone to get the first chance to ask the guy a question. They're fangirling on this guy, and then we've got Jessica Joustra, and so Calvin Seminary is very much trying to sort of hit the times. And I think, one of the things that I thought of a lot in this HSR war was Calvin University is usually right in the crosshairs of any of these culture war issues, and Kristen Kobes-Dumais, the first and only Calvin professor to ever have a book in the New York Times bestseller, James K. Smith, somebody who very much made a big splash in terms of the evangelical circuit, and both of these individuals could be, I don't know if they're on their way out or not, I assume they're tenured, but very much a sense of, by virtue of the postures that they've taken publicly, there's a sense of, are they going to make the curve on the vibe shift? And so then we have the provost and the president of the board. President of the board's a lawyer, and I'll tell you, I listened to his speech and I thought, if you wanted to know what points you had to hit in talking to this post-vibe shift synod, post-exile synod, it was like bang, bang, bang. That's what lawyers do. Lawyers know the jury, they pick the jury, they know their notes, it's like bang, 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 and the provost too, and they wowed them in. So we're seeing the institutions attempting to pivot. And we talked last night, we didn't record it, but Rod and I have interesting positions in the denomination. We're at the age now where we're sort of supposed to be peaking in terms of our influence, and
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's been a journey.
You've peaked.
But part of the reason someone might ask, why are the three of you making this video? We're the leftovers because we live on the West Coast. We're the last ones here.
First to get here, last to leave.
First to get here, that's right, first in, last out. And Rod and I, for a long time, have, with our relationship with the CRC central institutions, now that, in a sense, I spoke about the hub and spoke to more of a neural network, I was called to a table of people from Grand Rapids East, their leftovers, who are just trying to figure out what happens now. And in some ways they're liberated, because all of those elites were, doing their thing through the institutions, and so now the leftovers are there. But all of us are sort of fringe people, but yet via the new reality, it used to be 50, 75 years ago, if you wanted to exert influence in the network, you had to be at the hub. And the spokes were the banner, the circulatory system. And now, via the internet, via all kinds of other things, Rod and I don't want to sound prideful, but Rod and I have influence. You have influence, but you're still young and beginning, so your influence will continue to grow.
I have not peaked yet.
If you don't screw up.
Oh.
Right.
Well,
There's that.
so what does it look like now? And I don't have an answer for this, but what does it look like now in this new reality of the CRC? Because part of we've been forefronting this diversity word for a long time. And part of what assimilation means is that the Dutch immigrant dynamics and the dynamics around the hub. I went through Calvin Seminary. I went through Eastern Christian with a group of people. I went through Calvin College with a group of people. I went through Calvin Seminary with a group of people. Those were the hubs. And then the spokes went out, and we would go out throughout the world. Now, you just look around Synod, and there's lots of different groups, and they have their own cultures, and yet we're into different networks. And this is going to go out on YouTube. I had my YouTube channel. Last Synod I went to was in 2022, and some people had watched my videos. More people came to me at this Synod to want to talk about my videos, and so, that's just part of how YouTube works. In time, things get discovered.
I feel like if I think of, and it feels icky to talk about influence, honestly. Just like
I know it does, but I think we should.
But, so.
It's real.
Well, yeah. Well, I definitely have part of my fear in losing a group of people that I very much enjoyed within the denomination, and losing, for as a female minister, some very qualified and experienced female ministers leaving.
Yep.
Like that creates a vacuum.
Yep.
That's hard because I'm watching women that I absolutely have respected, like watched from afar, admired, and not all of them, but watching them leave, like when those, back in the spring when those RCA classes meetings were happening and the pictures that would come out, and I'm like blowing up the picture on my screen and counting like, oh me, oh her too, that's hard. I think the influence piece still has a piece in Grand Rapids. Like I did a distance program, but it was hybrid. So I spent a week on campus each semester. My continued, I think, relationship with leadership has been, I'm out here, but I come back for worship symposium. I go to Festival of Faith and Writing. I'm at Western Seminary now, but I was, I'm still in Grand Rapids at least yearly. I'm at a synod. So there is a piece of I can do the distance thing, but you still have to, I think, be physically in the space, which is still Grand Rapids. I think we did great in Hamilton this year. I think this was a gift. But there is still an on-the-ground piece where I think Grand Rapids is still a hub because that's where our institutions physically are.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think, Rod? You've been on. You and I have flown a lot of miles between Tucson, Sacramento, and Grand Rapids.
We talked a little bit about I'm the ultimate insider and the ultimate outsider, right? I served as a president of the Board of Home Missions for a couple of years, and so did you. My church wasn't within the CRC when I am serving as in that position. And I think it was John Rosenbaum who said, Rod, you come in from the desert, you yell at us, make us feel bad that we're not doing it right, and then you go back to the desert, eat your honey and locusts, and then 6 months later you come back and yell at us again. You feel bad. So that influence thing is a weird thing, right? Because somebody asked, Andy, I guess, my table mate asked something of one of the banner and said, the only reason Paul Vanderclay did this crazy thing to bring up Rod was so that Rod can get his name in the banner, and the person said, Rod always gets his name in the banner. And there's that, right? But when you say influence, do I think the influence is actually the crazy church that God grew up around me, right? I'm sort of a product of that more than, like, if you really look at it, Eric Siepen, my co-pastor, is the developer of a whole new way of discipling. He's a developer of a whole new way of praying, the Trinitarian prayer stuff. I shared that with some people. Oh, like this is very cool. Like, and there's this sense in me that because we were not bound by the institution the way you do if you live in the glass house of Grand Rapids, we could experiment and we could try and we could do new things. And we didn't have the baggage of a Dutch culture that said, this is the right way, right? There's literally no one in my church that has any Christian Reformed connection ever, or even knew about it. So because of that, when you're way out on the edge, the influence you have is coming in out of the desert, yelling at people, making them feel bad, and going back. And then it doesn't affect, like, any decision we make denominationally has zero effect on my life. Yeah. I'm not, I mean, except that I want to submit to it, right? Like, I don't have any, like, you take away my money, you're not giving me any. Like, you're going to threaten to take away my position, okay? You know, like, you have zero power in my life to influence how I think or influence what I do, and that's been a powerful gift and kind of a curse too, because you then, well, yeah, he can get away with that out there, but here, you know, we need to do it right. And I don't know how to navigate that, and I don't know how that bodes for, yes, influence, but the influence is not necessarily leadership, right? So what we've got to look for is the influential leader, and that's a different subject.
Well, you definitely exert leadership in the denomination, Rod. I mean, you were president of the Board of Home Missions. People listen to you, people respect you. And I think when you bring out Andy and Silent Bob, people see that.
Right.
That, okay, so, I mean, part of the reality is that in a lot of our places, it's not, if you want to go to synod, it's not hard. You just say, okay, I'll go, and then you get to go. And I think part of it is that the Christian Reformed Church is in a place now where it needs and is looking for hope. You know, you look again at Scott Vanderplug and what he's doing in Florida. And part of his influence is he's done something, he's doing something. You look at, you know, Kevin Adams' influence. You know, he planted Granite Springs, and so people have kept the line, the connection with Grand Rapids, with the center, and have, you know, exerted influence and tried things. And, you know, we should say that, you know, I'm looking forward to, have you gotten the grant yet? It's still up there?
July 1st is when we should find out.
Okay, so I'm really looking forward to Christ Church Davis having a conference.
Not really. We're looking, the proposal, the hope is to bring people to us though. It's to do a year-long cohort, but twice bring the people in the cohort out to Christ Church for 2 different weekends.
I'll take it. And so again, part of what this new distributed CRC that this, the elites are sort of prematurely left is there is space for new influence and and to have, why don't, do you guys do a conference?
We did on discipleship. Nobody came. Well, that's not true. We had probably 50, nobody came from our classes, which was weird. We had about 50 people come.
Okay.
And John Ben Donk, I love the man, and he came and said, Rod, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. It's brilliant. If I were to plant a church, I would do this. My kids would love this. This would be awesome. The problem is, I have no way to bring that back to my church. Like, I can't. Crosspoint is, I don't know how it would adapt, how it would change, because it's so unique, right? Like how you do this is a beautiful thing, but now what? Like, and I think, so what, and it just struck me that you can influence her, and I can influence you and her. But I'm aging out. Like I am one of those old guys that's gonna just wander off into the, weeds one day and not be found. Although there are those who said I've been doing that a lot. Anyway.
I believe you'll be taken up into glory. We just
Right.
we will go looking and we will not be able to find you.
Right. But you have the opportunity to bridge that institutional stuff and be the outsider who's been influenced by those who think of a new way, or like, and I think that's true with Andy Littleton. Like, I'm not going to do it. But he could. And there is a day I could imagine where he could be the director of the denomination, or hold those positions, because, and then bring that influence that we've had and that you've had on him into, but then our kids are going to rebel against that, so.
And all the Orthodox say, you darn Protestants, you keep shooting yourselves in the foot generationally. It is interesting how, because, okay, so we are the three leftovers, but when I think about who I want to do a video with, very much is the two of you. So that's not unintentional. And so part of my role is to sort of boost your signals. I want your voices heard in the denomination, even though the sound isn't great on these videos. I get it. I don't have a budget, people, and I'm not asking for one, because once you give me a budget, you can take it away. When I say something or do something that you don't like, I get it. But it's interesting how also the positions have moved around. So systematics professor of Calvin Seminary for many decades, probably the decades of Berkhoff, was perhaps the most influential leadership position in the denomination. The banner editor traditionally was a highly influential Kuyvenhoven, was a significant leader in the denomination. And so, so we've had general secretaries before. Leonard Hoffman, who just passed away, significant leader, but led in different ways. I met Peter Borgdorf's sister at First Hamilton. This lovely woman coming down the stairs, pretty aged now, and her name was, I believe, Margaret. Was it Margaret Tigelaar? And she sees us coming in, and, oh, you're visitors, who are you? And we're here for Senate. Oh, I'm Margaret. My brother is Peter Borgdorf.
Right.
And of course, we all know Peter Borgdorf. So, I want to see, one of the points that I made to Pete Yonker was that in I've always said of Grand Rapids, the gravity has been so great, not even light can escape. In other words, they often don't know a lot about the rest of the church. And he assumed that all church plants are sort of praise and worship expressive. That would be their liturgy. And it's like, no, that's not true. We have these Reformed, are you Reformed Catholic or Catholic Reformed?
Reformed Catholic.
Reformed Catholic.
Small c.
Small c. We have this movement going on in the church, and that's a really important movement. And I'd like to see that movement get a little bit more visibility. We'll talk representation. I'd like to see that movement get a little bit more visibility in the little synod videos, because it's, most of the videos, representation is true. Once you show a video, there's thousands of different messages that sort of come through about the ethnicity of the people, the culture of the people, the liturgy, all of these things. And I think it would help the CRC to see that, some of the growing places in the denomination, it is a very diverse denomination. It is very diverse, and again, diverse in diverse ways. And yet, as you said before, I think our challenge is going to be, okay, what unites us? And clearly, given, again, my interpretation of we just sort of raise the temperature on confessionality in order to deal with human sexuality, but that drum is still getting beaten. Oh my goodness, this synod was the synod of confessional alignment. It's like, anybody who doesn't say confessional alignment, we're going to look at you strange, because those are the new buzzwords. Those are the new holy words. And yet, push that a little bit. What exactly do you mean? And what aspects of the confession? Baptism, is that something that we need to flex on in order to, so.
And that came up in the Calvin University thing, and no one commented on it. Like, we'll have wiggle room on something like baptism, which I'm like, the sacraments, that's where we're choosing to have wiggle room? Calvin Universe, there's pieces of it.
But the tensions are part of the life. So that's what I got. You guys go.
I love the CRC. I just love it. I love this. I love being an insider. I love being an outsider. I love singing a doxology with great fervor and life and joy. It's hard for me, even in this season, to grieve, because it goes on. And yes, dear people who I truly love and respect and admire are not going to go further in the journey, but I can't stop. And I don't know what it would take to make me leave. I fought so hard to stay in.
You don't worship in a CRC church, Rod.
Right. Right.
The insider or outsider. I'm sorry, keep going.
No, it makes my heart glad to have all this. Even my conservative Baptist wife, who I marry outside the faith, and I should have married Nancy Wonders. My mom had Nancy Wonders, and she was a good Dutch girl, right? And that would have been great. But no, I married outside the faith. But Kathy loves my Dutch culture. We have Delft. We have decorated our bathroom with Delft blue and color. It's insane how much she appreciates what so many have disparaged, right? She wouldn't burn wooden shoes if you held a gun to her head. and neither would anyone in my little church. They love my Dutch heritage. They don't understand it. They don't get it. They don't understand the CRC stuff. But the more but they love me and they want to hear the stories. They want to hear stories of my farm life and they want to hear stories of my Dutch heritage. And man, I hate that I'm glad we're leaving the wooden shoe, but I think then what does connect us and what makes this go forward is a huge thing that we're going to wrestle through.
And, for me, being new to the CRC, only almost 25 years, but, and my 4 children being baptized, but, as in Peter Youngers, I'm a liturgy nerd, right? Like, practice is and formation is what gets me excited. And so when I'm in Grand Rapids, I go, and if I'm there on a Sunday, I will hit 3 church services. Like, I will plan my Sunday by how many church services I can fit in. Because I find the choices we make around our worship space and the liturgy of the service and within our preaching choices, I find that so fascinating. And so my CRC bingo card is continuing to grow. And I have found beautiful things and I have found very concerning things among the breadth of what is represented out there in the CRC church landscape. Like, I had one Sunday where I was at Encounter, I was at La Grave, and I was at First Hudson for the evening service. That was a wild CRC roller coaster of experience. And there were some things I was excited about, and there were some things that were wildly concerning to me. And my concern now is if we can continue to drill down on confessionalism as the only way we can be unified.
Yeah.
It just seems like it ends up being thought policing at a certain point, right? That we have full confessional alignment, fully, wholeheartedly, immediately, all of these things, which is a hindrance to discipleship, and having people grow into this space. I grew into this space. I didn't know what Reformed was. But I think that leaning into practice. How do we live out what we believe in ways that are not, again, policing, but at least we're all oriented in the same direction. There were concerns of mine on that particular Sunday in the greater Grand Rapids area about us not even understanding what the church is in the same ways. So how are we going to be united?
Raj Binding was a delightful pastor who loved me and would drive from Phoenix to Tucson on a regular basis just to buy my lunch and take us out to dinner. And so he came to a worship service at the Village, and I was uncomfortable that he was going to be there. And afterwards he comes up with tears in his eyes and he said, "That sermon was incredibly reformed. All of your songs, even though we've written a lot of them, were taken directly from scripture or from the creeds and confessions. You had your little kids come up and lead the congregation in reciting the Apostles' Creed. This church, you ate together afterward. This church is the church of 1950. If the people out in Sun City where he went to church, all the retirees he says, if they came down here and they got past the noise of the music and the weird configuration of couches and chairs and blah, 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 if they could get past all that and just actually listen to the content, this is the church of the 1950s. You somehow pulled that off in a whole unique way. And that was eye-opening to me because I hadn't planned that but it's who I am, and yes. And how we take communion every week, right? Because Calvin said we should, right? Like it is that kind of stuff, right? So, but you're right. I don't know how that. I think that we went sideways with the church growth movement stuff because then it was just about getting butts in the seats, right? Like it was, and we didn't practice the discipleship that happened when I was young. And I think that route of moving away from the evangelism-driven church to the discipleship-driven church is going to change a lot, because then the heritage comes alive in a much richer way. But you're right, I visit lots of churches too. I get to preach in lots of churches because I'm retired now. It's like, oh, but they're just all over the map. And practice has to be that way, and particularly when you start going into, different cultural stuff, like,
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? That it's not a cookie cutter uniform, like an Anglican church even necessarily, where it's
Right.
like you are going to get the same thing wherever you go. Like, how does it make sense contextually for the CRC and the CRC expression? But what? I think we seem to have lost best practice. What are, like, if we're at least oriented toward the same thing, that you can actually feel the reformed pieces coming together in a service, and it's a thoughtful service, and that elevates the sacraments. I appreciate your weekly Lord's Supper, but how does this form us and unify us as well? Making space for not every church is going to be able to live it out in the same way.
and differ from a Presbyterian church, and differ from, like if we're really going to carve out our own thing, what does that look like?
It was.
That's your job.
Oh
It's not
wow!
ours.
Well, I think this synod has been interesting for me to be brought up against the stuff that I've been kind of thinking through and living into, and then meeting. Your delegation basically of your disciples, and the church planning energy
Yeah,
that I wasn't expecting
yeah.
to feel and be like, oh, how would these things? And I
Right.
mean, obviously my co-pastor is a church planner, so he has lived it and experienced it in different ways. But yeah, I think that's an interesting intersection.
Synod worship, we met it in Jim. Synod is a church plant. We met it in Jim. We sat in chairs. We sung words off the screen. We had guitars. We had a little, keyboard, guitar, box ensemble. Lots of hands in the air. I'm old enough to remember my first synod. I remember was in the FAC at Calvin College. I think my father and my grandfather were there, and I don't know if they're, but we were sitting up in the gallery, and I was a little boy, and of course I still can't sit still. You now know that, sitting next to me at synod. And so my grandma, she could never sit still either, so she took me by the hand and we walked through, the science building, because she hadn't seen that building. But Christian Reformed Church has changed in practice quite dramatically, and the influences of assimilation are definitely present. And in many ways, part of what this exile means is, if anything, the exiled, especially Church of the Servant, was much more your tribe, your sub-tribe in the CRC, and that exile was much more mainline-ish than evangelical. And so in some ways, this particular exile will sort of move the whole church probably more into the evangelical, big box, big sound. But part of what's happening, though, is very much the movement of demographics. The CRC has long been, there's a lot of blue collar in the CRC. Has been for a long time, even though we value formal education. And the CRC has sort of moved up the caste system in the United States. The CRC has people who are influential, well-connected, all the way up into the heights of power in Washington, et cetera, et cetera. So how this shakes out liturgically will be interesting to watch, because a lot of what assimilation and home missions has meant, especially in the 80s and 90s and aughts, when home missions was planting churches, was a big turn towards the seeker movement. And the emergent movement, which had more intentional liturgical vibes, but so much of the emerging church movement just, collapsed into deconstruction, and then a lot of people on the bottom of that, then that sort of brought about this Orthodox moment. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this goes. But you look at the different church planting growth areas we have in the CRC now. You've got Fort St. Lucie, Florida, with Scott. You've got you guys in Tucson. You've got us in Sacramento to a degree. We still have to figure out how to get back on that church planting horse after some of our things over the last few years.
Well, and yeah.
Because-
I've expressed I just feel generally uncomfortable with like the church. I have a hard time engaging in the church planting conversation because I'm still like, I am concerned about our established churches. Like,
You and my co-pastor would greatly agree on that. He just wrote a paper about that of we need to just bolster the churches that we have and stop, because we're not actually changing anything by planting churches. So he and I disagree, but we always have. So.
Your senior pastor was the church planter of the church that you planted.
and here's the thing. When is a church plant not called a church plant anymore? I'm like, it's about to be 15 years at Christ Church, and everyone's like, oh, you're at a church plant. And I'm like,
That's
hilarious.
The village has been around for 25 years, and people will still refer to us as a church plant. I go, no, and then Mission Church that just became an established CRC church, Andy pastors, like, no one calls, they still, like, they've been at it for what, 6-7 years now. It's like, oh well, they've taken the plunge, so they're no longer a church plant, but the village is still considered.
We're an established church and have been for I don't know how many
Right.
years. And I'm just like, when do we get to sit at the adult table?
If things get more wobbly at Living Stones, you'll be holding my credential.
You don't ever get to sit at the adult table. That's what I've learned.
That's a good point. Yeah, all right. So we will land the plane. Thank you both for this. We had a little bit of time this afternoon. I thought one last chance while we've got you, and no key grip. I will make sure we don't lose this video.
Okay.
Oh.